Welcome to today's web event, PowerPoint for Presentations, with Amanda Kozira. Amanda is a former actor and stage manager who left the bright lights of New York City to pursue librarianship. She joined CWRU as their digital learning and scholarship librarian in 2014 and manages the Friedman Center for Digital Scholarship. Today, Amanda will be talking to you about how to improve your PowerPoints. This webinar will teach you how to utilize storytelling techniques to create crowd-engaging PowerPoint presentations. Design tips will be discussed, and resources for images, templates, and other design aspects will also be provided. So without further ado, hello, Amanda, are you there?
I am.
All right, great. We're very excited to get started. So if you're ready, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Go right ahead. Thank you, everybody, so much for being here, and to Swan for inviting me to go ahead and do this. As you noticed in my introduction, I am not a graphic designer or anything like that. I can barely draw a stick figure. So you don't need to have any sort of artistic background or anything like that to do anything that I'm talking about today. So the first thing, let's see here. There we go. So I mentioned storytelling techniques. From my background as an actor, one of the things we talk a lot about is about storytelling. And I actually have a whole separate presentation about how to apply acting techniques and storytelling and everything like that to developing presentations and things like that. So I'm just going to give sort of the very basics to start out with, because before you even touch PowerPoint, you want to have an idea of what you're actually going to be talking about. So you want at least a rough outline before you start on your slides, so that you have an idea of what you're actually going to want to put up on screen to support what you're saying. So the first thing that I usually go ahead and consider is the audience that I'm going to be speaking to. So the audience can help determine what sorts of images are going to be appropriate to go ahead and put in your slides. Also, the type of language that it's going to be appropriate to put on your slides. You might use different terms or phrases depending on who your audience is. For example, if you're giving a presentation to kids, you might be using a little bit more clip art, you might be using something a little bit more fun, and you might be using slightly more simple language on your slides. But if you are presenting perhaps to other library professionals, then you might be using different images, and you might be using actually field-specific terms or jargon. I usually recommend avoiding jargon in either speaking or on your slides, unless the audience that you are speaking to is already on the same page with you, because you don't want to go in and then essentially be speaking a different language as your audience, or be putting that up on your slides, because then there's going to cause a little bit of disconnect, and they're going to sit there wondering, well, what exactly does that actually mean, instead of actually paying attention to what you're saying. The other thing that it's good to consider ahead of time, if possible, is whether or not if there's anybody in the audience that might be colorblind or have any other sort of visual impairments or difficulties seeing particular things. So that way you can adjust your color scheme or the size of your fonts, the size of your images, things like that, in order to be able to accommodate that ahead of time. The next thing that I like to consider, even before starting to lay out anything, is the setting. I recognize that a lot of times when we're giving presentations, we don't actually get to go to the setting ahead of time and actually get to play with the equipment. But if you can, it is a big benefit, because then you can see in the space whether or not there might be any lighting issues that you want to be aware of, and that might affect the color choices that you make in terms of your slides, and how large you make your images, or how large you make your fonts, and things of that nature. The other thing to be aware of is if you're embedding video or audio, I find it very helpful to be able to test that actually in the space ahead of time, because I know I've certainly had issues, and I'm sure many other people have as well, where I've gone ahead and I've embedded a video, or I've embedded some audio into my PowerPoint, and it works great when I'm testing it at home or at work or anything like that. And then the minute that I get up there and I'm speaking and I'm trying to use it, there's a sound issue, it doesn't play right, something like that, just because we all know that technology can be a little bit wonky, and just because it works in one place doesn't mean it will work in another. So if you are going to use video and audio, just be aware of some of the difficulties or potential difficulties of embedding that into your PowerPoint presentation. So I don't say that you shouldn't use them, because obviously video and audio can be very, very engaging. But it's just something to be cautious with if you don't get the opportunity to test it out in advance in the space where you're going to be doing your presentation. And then the last thing that I wanted to bring up was actually the structure of the presentation. You really, before you even start plotting out all of your slides, want to consider what exactly you want your audience to get out of your presentation. Like, what are the main points that you really, really want to drive home, and what you want them to be able to take away with them. You want to consider, like, how do you want them to feel by the end? You know, are you trying to motivate them to take an action, or are you educating them in order so that they can take information back with them and make changes? Think about these sorts of things while you're planning out your presentation, and then you can actually go ahead and use your slides to help support those main points and help support you know, evoking these different feelings, or motivating them to hopefully take some action, you know, once the presentation is over and they've left. And you also want to think about what you want that outcome to be, and what you want to happen, you know, a day or a week, you know, after you've given the presentation. So you can go ahead and you can, once you've got that structure, you can go ahead and you can lay out your slides to help emphasize those points. And I always recommend structuring presentations and the PowerPoints that go along with them like a story. It's okay to have moments of emphasis where you're using perhaps brighter colors or larger pictures or something that's a little different than what you've had on the screen before, in order to emphasize a main point. And it's okay. We talk in storytelling, you have moments of emphasis, and then you can have the climax and the rising action, the climax, and the falling action. And it's okay, again, to use the visual assets that you have available to you in your PowerPoint to mark those moments, to mark the climax of the story, the main point that you really want, you know, people to be able to take away, and to be able to represent that visually in your slides. And that will produce, that in and of itself will produce a slightly more dynamic PowerPoint presentation. Once you just have that structure, you'll know which slides you'll want to perhaps make a little bit different or stand out a little bit more from the others. So, design tips. The number one thing I always try to keep in mind is that less is more. The slides are there to support you, to help make your point, but not to distract from what you're actually saying. I'm sure all of us have gone to presentations where we've seen slides that are overloaded with text or images to the point where it's really impossible to pay attention to both what the speaker is saying and to the slides themselves. And people are naturally very visual, so your eye is going to be drawn to the screen no matter what the speaker is saying. So if if they've put their entire speech essentially up on the slide, then the audience is naturally going to want to sit there and have their eyes drawn to that and try to read it. And if it's difficult to read and listen to what the speaker's saying, the reading is going to overcome, and it's going to cause sort of a disconnect between what is up on the screen and what the presenter is actually trying to do. So please don't just put a bunch of words up there and then turn your back to the audience and just read it. That makes for not a very engaging presentation, really, for anybody. So it's much better to go ahead and keep your slides fairly simple, and use them to just support the main points of what you're talking about so that they're able to, quickly at a glance kind of get the idea of what you're going to be mentioning and then really be able to pay attention to everything that you're saying going forward. I've already talked a little bit about about text, and I'll probably continue to hammer that point home a bit throughout my presentation, but large blocks of text are really hard to read and they'll distract people from the presentation. So go ahead and just make the main points clear. And if you absolutely have, a ton of detail that has to be expressed in a textual way, don't put it all up on the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint should work with you, but if you're not able to explain in perfect detail everything that you want to, it's okay to have some handouts that accompany the presentation or that you hand out later to go ahead and go into slightly more detailed explanation. But don't put everything up on the PowerPoint slide. Presentations are very visual, so I always recommend having less text and more graphics. Clear and easy to understand graphics are going to take you a lot farther than text anyway. The old adage of a picture is worth 1,000 words, I find to be extremely true, particularly when we're talking about anything related to a presentation. I know a lot of the presentations that I deal with have me presenting some sort of data of some kind. And so it's usually better if you have numbers or any sort of statistics or any sort of data that you want to represent to try and find a visual way of representing that data, because people are very visual and it's going to be a lot easier for people to see a chart or a graph and then instantly sort of be able to grasp what is going on, as opposed to seeing a list of numbers or statistics or something like that. As you can see, I've gone ahead and I've put up just a sort of a quick screenshot of some different types of examples of visualizations that you can use to express data in different ways. And there's actually a resource that I will share at the end that helps you decide what type of visualization fits your data best, so that you can go ahead and more clearly present it to your audience. And it's one of my favorite resources, so I'm very excited to show that at the end. Graphs. So I've already mentioned a little bit. I very much encourage the use of graphs, charts, and even tables to an extent. But when you are using these in order to express data visually in some way, you want to make sure that they're not overly complex and cluttered. Even visualizations sometimes, and I'm sure you've seen a few, can be a little difficult to understand at a glance sometimes. Sometimes the color choices, if you want to be very careful about those, you want to be able to choose colors that stand out when placed next to each other. So for example, on here, the pie chart here has orange, blue, and green. It's very easy to distinguish the different pieces of the pie chart from each other. Whereas if you just chose, maybe different shades of blue and you had a lot of things that you were showing, one might sort of fade into the other. And that makes it a little bit harder for the audience to be able to understand what's going on. The other thing that I recommend is going ahead and using just solid colors as opposed to patterns. Find patterns like little polka dots or little lines or something like that. They don't stand out a whole lot, particularly on slides. So it's a good idea to go ahead and just stick to solid colors as opposed to trying to use different patterns and things like that to distinguish between the different groups that you are trying to represent in your graph or your chart. Tables. So graphs and charts of some kind, I usually recommend over tables because, as you can see by the example that I have on the screen here, sometimes tables can be a little difficult to read if you don't tweak them. I have seen more than a few presentations that use graphs from paper, or that use tables, excuse me, from papers, such as the one that is up on the screen. And frankly, I find that a little bit difficult to visually understand at a glance. That I'm going to have to be staring at for a little while in order to really start to understand what's going on, even when the speaker is standing there and sort of explaining it to me. So if you're going to use a table, don't go ahead and actually just do it in black and white and very compact, like the example that I have up on the screen here. You'll want to go ahead and make sure that you use plenty of space around within each of the different cells on each of the different columns and rows. And you'll want to go ahead and use a little bit of color and a little bit of shading in order to really make the information stand out. Because otherwise, you'll end up with something like this, and that is just not particularly visually appealing and will, again, distract your audience from the point that you're trying to make. You want to use the slides to support your point, as opposed to having them look at your slides and wondering wondering exactly what you're trying to express with them. Space. Space is incredibly important. And when I say space, I'm referring to what I will sometimes refer to as white space or margins, sort of the empty space that you leave around all of your images and in between your bullet points and things of that nature. It's really, really important to go ahead and leave sort of a margin around the different slides. It's difficult to read presentations that have content that you've created that runs all the way to the edge. Now you'll see that the template that I'm using does have some visual elements that go all the way to the edge of the slide, and I think that's okay. It's when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about the content that you're adding to the slide. So there should be, as you can see, I've left quite a fair amount of space around my bullet points and in between the bullet points and the graphical element that I'm using, and in between all of that and the actual title part of it. And that makes it easier to read. So you want to make sure that you do that with every element that's on your slide, the title, the text, all of the visual elements. That's also one of the reasons why I recommend using bullet points as opposed to full sentences on slides. It's a lot easier to quickly absorb text as a bullet point than it is as a full sentence, or please don't ever put a paragraph on a slide. That's just way too much information to have going on to a slide and still expect the audience to be able to pay attention to what the speaker is saying. Fonts. You want to choose your fonts wisely. Usually I recommend sans serif fonts because they are a little bit easier for the brain to process, as opposed to the serif fonts. And for those of you who don't know what the sans serif or the serif, in a font like Times New Roman, there are little sort of lines at the end of the T and sort of at the bottom of it, and those are called serifs. And you'll see in sans serif fonts, like the ones I'm using here, you don't have some of those extra markings, so they're a little bit rounder, and that means that we're able to process them a little bit faster, as opposed to the serif fonts, which are great if you're actually going to be having something printed out, because it'll slow things down just a little bit and it'll increase your ability to intake the information because you're slowing down to actually comprehend it. So using multiple fonts is also a bit distracting, so I recommend sticking to just a couple of them. Excuse me, I need so just a couple of fonts, and you'll want to make sure that those fonts are complementary to each other. So you probably will have a different font for the title of your slides than you will for the main text on your slides. And you may add one more font beyond that, but I wouldn't recommend more than that. You can go ahead and you can use things like sizing, italics, color, and bolding items in order to make text pop when you need to. While using color to make the text pop is good, you also want to be very careful about your color choices to make sure that they're easy to read and they don't clash with your background. And I have some examples here of some fonts that, while are very eye-catching and interesting, If you use them a little too much, then they become very difficult to read, and they can kind of very quickly overtake the slide, and kind of, you'll take, the audience will sort of take a step back and say, it's going to take me a minute to really understand what's going on this slide. And again, anytime that happens, they're not paying attention to you and the point that you're trying to make. They're trying to figure out what is going on the screen. And the same thing with the color. You want to be very careful that people aren't struggling to understand exactly what it is that you are putting up on the screen. So for example, the white on yellow is very, very, very difficult to read, and so the audience would be distracted by that. Another thing to be aware of when you're choosing your fonts is that presentation slides are read and seen at a distance, which means your font sizes need to be a lot larger than when we are writing a paper or something like that. So you really want this to be able to be read very easily from a few feet away. So what I recommend doing is going ahead and putting your slide into presentation mode and then stepping a few feet back from your screen and then seeing if you can read it easily. If you can't read it easily, then you need to bump up the font. And that may mean cutting some text or shifting some points to another slide, and that's okay. It's better to have more slides that can be easily digested than to have fewer slides that are way too cluttered to really be able to comprehend what's going on them. So color. I highly, highly, highly recommend the use of color, mostly because if we just got up there with a black and white PowerPoint, especially in this day and age, I think we'd find that all a bit boring. But you want to be careful in your color choices. You don't want to use colors that are difficult for people to view for long times, like neon colors. And you do want to go ahead and use it to highlight important information. Proper color contrast can reduce eye strain and make the slides more legible and more visually interesting. But using color in the wrong way will decrease the impact of your data and the points that you're making, and people, again, will sort of be spending more time trying to figure out exactly what is going on the slide as opposed to the point that you were trying to make. So when you do use color, don't go overboard. Not everything has to be color, so you can mix that in with black and white or neutrals. And overall, you want to avoid lots of patterns that are going to be distracting. And a lot of this is impacted if you go ahead and use a PowerPoint template, then a lot of times that will go ahead and it'll give you a set of colors that all work together well, and a set of backgrounds that will work well with those colors. But you still want to be careful because sometimes templates make some interesting choices that you may want to adjust. So it's also always a good idea to go ahead and run a sample slide by somebody else so that they can also let you know whether or not they think it's easy to read, whether or not the colors work, and whether or not your font choices are easy to read, and whether or not everything is large enough. And again, I went ahead and I put up some examples of different colored text on different colored backgrounds, and you can see that some of them are a lot easier to read than others. So you just want to be very careful. You want to use color, but you want to be careful about your choices. So the next thing I wanted to discuss were some features in PowerPoint that I found very particularly useful in making sure that my PowerPoint slides end up looking okay. So the number one thing that I recommend is to embed your fonts when you save your PowerPoint. This prevents the issue of getting to a place where you're presenting and then plugging your PowerPoint presentation in and going, oh my goodness, they don't have the fonts that I, spent all this time using in my PowerPoint, and now everything looks wrong, and I have 2 minutes before I'm supposed to speak to fix it. That has happened to me, and I have learned my lesson. So you always want to go ahead and save and embed the fonts. And you can do this by going to File, Save As, tools, and in the save options, there is the option to embed the fonts. And I will give the caveat that I have PowerPoint 2010, so I'm a couple of generations behind, and while these features should still be in the more updated versions of PowerPoint, they might be in slightly different places than what I have listed here. So this is for PowerPoint 2010. The next thing that I highly recommend playing with is the Smart Art, actually, which is just under the Insert tab and then in Smart Art. So if you do have lists, processes, different types of relationships you need to show, or some sort of hierarchy, I actually find the Smart Art as being a very easy to use, more visually interesting way of being able to show some of these without having to go through and create, tons of shapes and try to figure out how to lay those out in the best manner individually, as opposed to having one graphic which is all linked together, which I can pretty much just plug some text and maybe a couple images into, and it creates something that works with the template that I have. So I find the Smart Art to be extremely useful, and obviously your mileage will vary with that a little bit, but I highly recommend playing with it and seeing whether or not it will work for some of the things that you want to show your audience. And a couple of other things that I found really useful, particularly if you're using PowerPoint templates that didn't actually come from PowerPoint, if you've gone onto another site and downloaded templates from there that you're using, it's really very helpful to be able to go ahead and create a new theme colors, because what this will do, the new theme colors will will automatically go ahead and start coloring your text. And if you need to recolor any images that you've put into PowerPoint, this will allow you to do it with the colors that you've chosen, as opposed to some of the default colors that PowerPoint has already selected. So to be able to do this, you can go into design, colors, and create new theme colors, and then you can pretty much pick any color of the rainbow to go ahead and set up. And it allows you to go ahead and pick 4 different text colors and like 6 different accent colors, as well as choose the color of the hyperlinks. So I find that to be incredibly useful, like I said, especially when I'm using a template that I've gotten from outside of PowerPoint itself. And then the last thing I always like to point out is the page setup menu, which is just under design, and then you go into page setup. And this is actually the very first thing that I recommend doing. So if you know that you're either presenting on widescreen or not widescreen, or if there is a particularly strange size screen that you know you're going to be presenting on, you can go ahead and actually plug in the exact height and width of the screen, and it will change the size of your slides in order to match that. That tends to be a little bit more useful if you're using PowerPoint to design for items that you're going to print, such as posters or flyers or something like that. You can go ahead and put in the particular paper sizes, and then the slide will be sized at that paper size, and it makes it a lot easier to print things. For when you're presenting on screen, it's just good if you know that if there's going to be strange screen sizes or something like that, or just to double check that it's going to be widescreen versus not widescreen, and what the aspect ratio is going to be, to go ahead and set that up in advance before you've gone ahead and created all of your slides. And then you go back and change this, then you'll have to probably go back and adjust all of your slides just a little bit. So the last thing that I was going to mention are some of the resources that I go ahead and I use when I'm going to create PowerPoints. So the first resource I want to mention is Slides Carnival, and that's where actually I've gotten a lot of my PowerPoint templates. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and bring that page over here. So this is slidescarnival.com, and it's free PowerPoint templates, and these all work for Google Slides as well. And what I really particularly love about these is you can go ahead and you can scroll through. They've got a lot of very, very visually interesting ones. And when you actually go ahead and you download them, and just give me a moment to bring up an example, what it does, it's a template that's not just sort of the images and the fonts in there on one slide and you go through, it actually gives you examples all the way through of how you can how they recommend that you go ahead and you use each of these particularly different slides that they have set up for you. And it'll give you ideas for how to emphasize big concepts and the fact that you can go ahead and you can split your content when you know, if you want to go ahead and put some things in with images, if you want to lay out particularly some different numbers and how you can do that very visually, to go ahead and how to insert graphs. And I particularly love if you were doing some sort of tablet project or phone project, it'll give you the actual outlines of iPads and things like that, where you can go ahead and then you can put your image in. So, and it'll also give you the fonts and tell you where to download the fonts, and it'll give you the hex codes for the different colors that you use, which make it really easy to set up the color scheme in PowerPoint later on. So I shamelessly use these templates all the time, and in fact the one I'm showing you right now is one of my favorite ones. I've done a couple of presentations with these, and I just find this resource, it's free. You just go ahead and you credit the template at the end of the presentation, and it's available. It's free and available to use. So this one is by far one of my favorites. In terms of getting images, there are a couple of places that I go. Probably the place that I go the most often is the Noun Project. So the Noun Project gives you sort of icons for just about anything that you can think of. So let's say I wanted an icon of a TV. I can go ahead and I can search for TV, and it gives me all different kinds of different icons that I can use. So I find this particularly useful, like if I'm just want to essentially, you know, make some bullet points on my slide, and I think it would be really useful to just have a couple of visual elements and a couple of words of sort of explaining that. And I use that in my that sort of motif in my PowerPoints quite a lot, like I did on the first slide that I showed you. I tend to go here, and they're really easy. They're all either public domain or Creative Commons license. So again, on that credit slide, you can go ahead and you can put the copy of the image that has the Creative Commons credit on just on that credit slide, and you are good to go. And you could crop these however you want for the remainder of your slides. These are also very easy to recolor in PowerPoint if you've gone ahead and you set up the color scheme the way that I mentioned earlier. The other tend to get images. If you want to go more of the clip art direction, you can go to openclipart.com, and these are public domain images that you can go ahead and you can search for, and everything is sort of free and available to use however you would like. So if you do need sketches or more colored images or something like that, you can go ahead and you can get some stuff from here. I mentioned earlier being able to visualize your data in different ways in order to make a point. The place that I go to get ideas for that is the Data Visualization Catalog. So what this does is it sort of lays out a lot. You can search by function, or you can view just sort of by a list of them. And it gives you lots and lots of different ideas of different types of data visualizations that you can come up with. And what I particularly love about it, let's go to pictogram. I really love pictograms, is it will give you a description of exactly what it is, an example of it, and it'll also link you to tools to be able to generate the visualization. Some of these are tools are more free than others, so they may link you to some tools that are free to use, but may have some of the features locked unless you pay for a subscription to them. But for the most part, I find it, again, really helpful to get ideas and to be able to link to some different places to make it easy to generate some of these visualizations to make your PowerPoints more interesting. And then the last resource that I wanted to go ahead and point out was to generate color schemes. And it's called Coolers, I guess, or maybe it's pronounced colors and you just ignore the other O. I'm not 100% sure. But you go ahead and you can go here and you can basically hop right into creating a color scheme and seeing how the different colors all work together. So you can hop right into this, and then let's say these are different shades of green that all seem to work together. Let's say I don't particularly like this one. I can click this and say, yeah, I think maybe that is a little bit more appropriate for the color scheme that I'm putting together. And it allows you just to go ahead and lay different colors out and see how they work next to each other very, very easily. And it will also give you the hex codes for all the different colors at the bottom. So it's very easy to go ahead and, again, go ahead and put these into PowerPoint. The one caveat I will say about colors in PowerPoint is when you are setting up your custom color templates, PowerPoint wants you to put it in an RGB, and most of the resources that I've mentioned here give it to you as a hex code. But you can go ahead and you can just Google a RGB to hex code or vice versa converter, and you pop in the hex code and it'll spit out the RGB code that you can go ahead and you can put into PowerPoint. And that's pretty easy to do. So at this point, I would really like to open it up to any questions that people may have. I know this was probably a fair amount of information in a relatively short period of time, but if you have any questions, I would certainly be happy to go ahead and answer them.